And then for both of you, if you could talk a little bit about your process in identifying partners and how you went about that.
Yeah, so in Marin, our process was, I would say, thoughtful in terms of we knew what the goal was, and we looked for the entities that could either give us access to the students or access to data or services, et cetera. We didn't have a backbone organization that kind of stepped up to say, we want to do this, we want to do this. And so as a community leader, I stepped up to say, I'm going to do it. And so what we really started saying is that we were the backbone team, and that we had a data person and facilitator, and I am the cat herder, and we have a fiscal agent that is a program delivering organization, and we're kind of a little offshoot of that organization. And so they give us office space, and they give us back office support, and they are our 501c3, and that's working for us right now. Our long-term goal is to find more what Jeff has talked about, a little bit more neutral entity to open their doors and let us live.
Okay, great, thanks. And Joe?
The planning year, which occurred, I came on right when the implementation year started. And the planning year actually saw like an incredibly wide breadth of partners engaging at that table. And so part of our experience was that as implementation came around, that sort of naturally began to separate folks out who was really committed to making the time. So there was a little bit of like a self-selection process there. And then so I would say that when I arrived, folks had sort of opted in. And then one of the keys for us now is just thinking about who are the critical untapped players that we're missing, because there's a few more holes to fill in, and then that's just a steady build of relationships with those folks.
Okay, great. And Jeff, you were talking before about having a couple of core staff, so I was wondering if any one of you wants to kind of speak to what is the role that the staff play in a collective impact model day to day? What are the roles that a staff is going to be, what are the hats that they're going to be wearing? What are the different types of things that they need to do? For any one of you?
The cat herder is the terminology that everybody uses for the leader, and that's the role I'm playing. So I'm waking up in the morning thinking about which partners are engaged, how are we making progress in our action teams, looking to engage individuals in the community that want to contribute, and figuring out what they can offer and how we use them. Could they be a facilitator? Do they have a connection to data expertise at one of our companies? So finding the right people to bring in, engaging the partners, and just making sure, like Jeff said, people aren't scratching each other to death, and that we're optimizing everything that we have already in our community, and frankly connecting people to a certain extent. Did you know they're doing this over here? Why don't you guys meet?
And I found in Cincinnati that I became less important than the data person.
Yeah.
And the data person's role, I'll never forget, I was in a place I can't remember. Winston-Salem. I was in Winston-Salem, and we were helping to facilitate an initial meeting of a lot of the folks coming together. And the whole time in this meeting, there was a woman in the back of the room whose mouth was just agape. And she was just like, and at first I thought she just thought I was awesome. But then after a while, I realized that there was something going on there. And so I just finally said, what's going on for you? You're holding something for the group. What is it? And she said, I'm a funder, and I feel like you're asking me to fund a data person in every single nonprofit in our community. And I can't do that. My board would freak out if I told them the only thing we were funding was data. They like data, but they don't want to fund that. They want to fund program. And so we said, that's perfect, right? The most important role among the backbone team is the data analyst. And the data analyst's job is to work directly with organizations that may not have the capacity, right? Getting back to one of the questions that was just asked. It's that you don't need a data person in every single organization. You can have data experts that go in and help the partners build their capacity, right? Or find ways to collect that data. Like in one case in Cincinnati, we had one community partner that ended up building a tutoring app so that the tutors could on their phone download what they did with the child that day. So it goes into a central database, right? That's phenomenal. That just changed the landscape of how we can understand the impact of tutoring. But that was done because the data analyst figured out that was an outage, and then the cat herder found a partner that could help figure out how to do that. And now all of a sudden you have all this data at your fingertips we never had before, right? And then the other thing they do is can do some of the analytics. They can help to do the analysis that shows how actions connect to outcomes. And then they can do it with other partners. And over time, you start to build the capacity of the community to figure out how to do that kind of stuff. But that probably in our minds is the most important role, right? Getting that piece of the puzzle fixed.
No, one example I can give in Marin, just real quickly, is that for the data analysts, we just knew our school districts didn't have the capacity or the people to do as much analytics. So what we were able to do is connect with an organization called Education Pioneers that brings this, many of you may know, that brings, data business people into the education space. So we're going to partner with one of our school districts to hire an education pioneer for the next year. And then we'll get access to the school district because we're partnering with them, and the same person will be working, helping them and doing some of these analytics for us. So that's a great example of how we're going to try. We'll let you know next year
I've
how it
seen
works.
a lot of communities do that. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
And Joe, you're just on, kind of the early end of this data collection, but what can you tell us? What are you learning about this effort around collecting data and shared data? And what are some of the challenges you've experienced and the opportunities?
Yeah. So it's interesting because we're on the very front end of this learning curve of our data person hasn't become the critical thing yet, right? But it's very obvious how that will happen. So we collected data across 9 partners, and it's a pretty critical process because you very quickly realize, okay, this agency collects all of this. This agency collects only this. They have these tools, and I think there's a couple things going on there that there's that's very touchy for people. That can feel very, I think, it can feel, as Jeff noted, data is a flashlight rather than a hammer. But in this sector, I feel like a lot of folks are used to being beaten up with the hammer. And so when you say, hey, I want to take a look at your data, and I want to share it with a bunch of other people, people are like, slow down. So I think it's just being, the critical thing is being really tuned in to the fact that you might make other folks uncomfortable, and you have to very delicately shift that conversation from, I need your data, I know you're a little bit worried about what may happen, but ultimately this is about moving the needle on behalf of young people and being a great steward of public and private resources. And that's a delicate conversation, but I think we learn that if we approach it in earnest, we'll make good progress. And then we contracted out to a data partner to Applied Survey Research because we didn't have that expertise in-house. And they are great because we're neutral because we're Kids in Common. We're just sort of a convener of folks, but they're even more neutral. So I think that has been really critical for us to move this process along. And then we just had to be ready to roll with evolving timelines and be respectful of our partners' time and other priorities.
Anne, I also just wanted to give you an opportunity to share anything about your slide. I think, you sort of jumped into some of the challenges and opportunities, but I don't know if you want to take a second just to talk a little bit more about the big picture of what you've been trying to do, or you feel like you've covered it?
I feel like we've talked about it, but we're really excited. We've taken a county-wide approach, and we've identified these 6 outcomes, which are the same 6 outcomes that Jeff talked about. And we've really developed this group that's committed to accelerating the closure of the Marin's achievement gap. And by working together, by holding ourselves accountable, by using data, and by aligning our activities and our resources. So, that's the big picture. It's exciting.
Okay, great. Yeah. I think the core of what your previous comments, Jeff, before were about this sort of continuous improvement piece and really looking at data in a really different way and kind of, focusing on the change that would come about from that data. And we also hear this catchphrase a lot. So I guess I was hoping that you all could shed a little bit of light on, what continuous improvement means for your work when you're talking about data. How has that shifted things, and, what does the road ahead look like?
So I can start with that. The health sector is about 15 to 20 years ahead of the education sector when it comes to using data. And probably the biggest mistake we made in Cincinnati was that we had these outcomes. We actually had 8. We still do in Cincinnati, have 8 total. And we started 22 networks of practitioners around those 8. How do you all think that went? All right. It did not go great. It was just too much. I was running around everywhere like a chicken with my head cut off. It was just dumb. So what the health sector would say is start small. And we literally had a person from our children's hospital come to one of our very first meetings way back in 2007 and say, do small tests of change. Do small tests of change. And I always thought that was ridiculous because I can't stand the word pilot. Because I have never seen it. My philosophy is pilots are where systems change goes to die, right? Because you do a pilot and it gets stuck there and nobody ever wants to learn from it. But what I've now learned, and what I would say we see continuous improvement looking like to folks, is they do these small tests of change, which means you start with maybe 2 or 3 schools, and you don't wait a full year to go to 5 or 6 schools. You try to learn from those 2 or 3 schools within 1 or 2 months, and then you engage more principals and more principals. So by the end of the year, you can be at 15 to 20 schools, right? But by starting small and figuring out how to collect that data, I love how you said the data person hasn't become the thing yet, right? By starting small, you position the data person to become the thing. But you don't make it a 3-year pilot, right? You make it a small test of change where you very quickly are iterating to understand programmatically what is really leading to success. Does that make sense? And I think that's something that we struggle with. One, because a lot of schools don't use benchmark data. They just use end of the year data. Well, that doesn't work. We got to figure out how to do benchmark assessments and start with those schools that have those, and then slowly build the value proposition so the schools that don't have them, will use them. Or if it's a nonprofit, you need access then to those benchmark assessments in order to know if your work is actually leading to the improvement. Well, that's where the data person comes in. So this is how continuous improvement starts, is with a small group of folks that can actually connect actions to outcomes, but very quickly iterating to include more folks over time.
And continuous improvement. What has that meant to your work?
I think we're still learning about that. And I think this idea of really getting down to the nitty-gritty is something that we need to get better about. One example I can give in Marin that's continuous improvement is that when we first started with trying to get more kids to fill out their financial aid forms, we were partnering with the United Way and the school districts and the nonprofits. And our first workshop, if you will, the United Way said, hey, this is great. We're going to collaborate because we help low-income families fill out their tax forms. And so we're going to combine our workshops together and have one big workshop where the parents can do their tax forms and then move over and do their FAFSA forms. Well, that didn't work very well because it wasn't the right people, it wasn't the right time, everything. So the next time we did it, we said, hey, rather than combining the 2 workshops, let's just get the experts from United Way to come to the FAFSA workshop and help out and train the trainers, if you will. So that's a small example of iteration over time. And then this year we did, as I described before, we collaborated more closely with the school districts to get to try to capture all of the kids who weren't going to these programs, who were sitting in class, obviously, to expose them to the financial aid workshop and get them to go and then have the counselors follow up with them. So that was our this year's iteration, if you will, and we'll be evaluating the results at the end of this year and doing it differently next year.
Great, thanks. And Joe, what has continuous improvement looked like in your process?
Like Anne, I think we're learning. We're early in that. I think one of the things that has been really it'll be the data piece. That will be continuous improvement.
Right.
We got our first round of data back, and one of the questions we asked was around special education or special needs, learning disabilities, and the data came back that 13% of the opportunity youth population in Santa Clara County had a learning disability. And then we looked at that. Well, we knew that a cohort of 9th graders in foster care had a rate of about 50%. So we knew obviously that didn't match up. And then we looked at the data and we saw, okay, half of our providers don't collect on that. 36% of those who did collect It was just self-reported information. So I think that's what continuous improvement will look like for us in the near term. It will be creating the environment where folks can, again, and it's using it as a flashlight, creating the space and being very dutiful in that, where folks can look at the data and we can pull some things apart. And then, because then what happened was everybody said, oh, we should probably record information on that. We should collect on that. So I think then with the idea of holding space for emergence, I think then the partners answer the question in a trajectory of improvement.
Just to pivot for a last question before we open it up, I think it's always on people's mind, the question of funding. So how do you get something like this funded? And so if you could each talk a little bit about that very briefly, I think the audience would like to hear about it.
Okay. In Marin, we started with individual funders. So we had 4 families who were really excited about this idea. They, each put money in, and we actually contracted with Strive to come and help consult with us. So we used our first money for that, as well as some staff help. And it was our goal from the very beginning to be a public-private partnership, and we did not want to have one funder that had the most control, because we have a very large community foundation in Marin, and when the Marin Community Foundation funds something, people come, and it would be very appealing to try to get them to fund it all, but we purposefully said we don't want them to be more than a third of our funding. So now the next year we had more individuals come to do it, and then the third year the County of Marin actually became a funder, as well as the Marin Community Foundation. And so now, and we also got a large family foundation give us a large matching grant. So now we're truly, I would say, we have public funding, we have foundation funding, we have individual funding, and so we're truly a community-funded organization. And we have funding for our backbone team for the next 2 years, so that we can now kind of do our work and start to think about how to institutionalize that funding. So we've said to our funders from the beginning, we want you to fund us as a startup, and then we're going to prove that this is a really valuable thing that the community is going to want, so that the community and the partners will step up and build us into their budget. Or an organization will step up and say, we want to fund this on an ongoing basis, whether it's the county government or the county Office of Education or something like that. So that's where we're sitting right now.
Great, thanks. Joe?
We've been fortunate. We received planning year money from the Aspen Institute, their Forum for Community Solutions, and then we got implementation year money. So that's what pays for the backbone, which is relatively cheap at this moment. And so that was sort of riding the wave of attention to both collective impact and opportunity youth. That's sort of, we've caught that wave and ridden it pretty effectively. But then what we've done really well is leverage that attention to get, we received money from the Santa Clara County to fund the data collection effort for 2 years. So we have that pretty well stabilized. We've got some other smaller pots of money. The Sobrato Family Foundation funded us to do some work on the employer cultivation side in partnership with the Chamber of Commerce. We're waiting to hear about, hopefully next week, knock on wood, we're going to hear about social innovation funds. And then potentially some other monies. And I guess what I would say, the key to all of that was partnership and collaboration. And partnerships and collaboration that are not in name only. I think what we're selling is that this is sincere partnership that is aimed at fundamentally changing the way in which we support opportunity youth, and I think people are attracted to that.
Jeff, obviously you've been at it a little bit longer, but I don't know if you want to briefly touch on funding opportunities.
I would just say that there's 2 sides. There's the funding of the backbone, and then there's the funding of the program, right? That needs to work. And I would just say that the hope is that investors in a given community over time begin to recognize and reward those programs and services that are a part of the partnership. So that means they ask the questions in the grant application locally. Are you a part of the partnership? Which outcome are you connected to? How are you collecting programmatic data? So that the folks that are willing to have the courage to step up and believe that data will be used as a flashlight, not a hammer, are rewarded over time. And so we see a lot of communities where one of the circles in the ecosystem that I put up there, the example from Indiana, Fort Wayne area, is that there is a circle in there for investors. And the key is to get the investors to start talking to each other and syncing up. And we've even seen communities where they've aligned their grant reports so that individual programs don't have to submit a different grant report. They can submit the action plan that's being developed by the partnership for a given outcome. That's powerful, right? That's when this type of work becomes really institutionalized. And we're also seeing that then it attracts national dollars. Because when you can say, we easily found 700,000 local dollars to go towards the entities that are collecting and using data, it's a much easier pitch to a national funder to say, can you match that? And so we're starting to see more of that happening too. And we've actually had Lumina Foundation. They used our methodology to kind of vet communities to be a part of a major national initiative. Great. Communities are getting rewarded for building the infrastructure. Great,
thanks. Now we'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. So we have a couple of colleagues running with mics. Kenji's over here.
Good morning. Thank you. It's been wonderful. I work with a domestic violence agency, and we're attempting to develop a collective impact around ending the violence. And I'm not sure, do you take the questions in a chunk rather than this incredibly large issue? And what is the process of that? And do you determine what impact you want before you go through the process?
So my answer to the last question would be yes.
Yes.
It would be determined. The first conversation is not what do you want to do? It's how are we going to measure our success? And that's critical. I was looking for a whiteboard because I'm a drawer. But the very first question for any group you bring together is how would we measure our success? And in an area like domestic violence, which I know very little about, shame on me, right? But I know very little about it. But the question would be, what is within the sphere of our control and what is not? So we see a lot of communities that create a data hierarchy, or a data flowchart would maybe be a better way to say it, which is what are the ultimate outcomes that we want to see move? So if it's ending domestic violence, I don't know what that would be, but you would say this is like our vital sign, right? Our pulse, whatever that is. Then the question would be, what are the contributing indicators towards that? So in education, an outcome might be early grade reading, and a contributing indicator might be attendance, right? Attendance wouldn't be an ultimate outcome. You want people to show up at school, but you really want them to learn how to read, right? So you say early grade reading would be the ultimate, attendance would be the contributing indicator. The question then for the group is, can we actually influence that contributing indicator, right? Some people want to say a contributing indicator to third grade reading is poverty. Okay, are you able to influence poverty, right? I don't know. I'm just saying, like that's a pretty big nugget, right? It may be easier to tackle attendance before you tackle poverty. Maybe. I don't know. But you try to identify what's within the sphere of your control, and then you be very transparent with people that we know we're not taking on everything, but we're taking on this ultimate outcome and these contributing indicators. And the reason is because we think we can actually influence that and see the result move at a population level. But that conversation of building that data flowchart, we recommend, is literally your first conversation. First one, right? Play around with your vision and mission and get everybody behind it, but make sure that you're focused on the result right up front.
I think the next question was over here.
Thank you. I'm wondering, as this process unfolds, it seems like there might be need from time to time for really difficult conversations. And I'm wondering if you could share with us examples of difficult conversations you've had and how you handled them.
Yeah, I can go with one. This is a difficult conversation that we're about to have, but we have an action team that is focused on college enrollment. And to Jeff's point, we want to get more low-income kids of color enrolled in college. And one of the strategies that the team came up with was we want more low-cost, high-quality SAT, ACT prep. And that's a really important thing because in Marin County, lots of kids can afford $1,000 prep and the low-income kids can't. So it's an issue of equity. The team now there's some people on the team that are saying, well, wait a minute, the kids that are doing SAT, ACT prep are already going to college, so that's not going to help us move that needle. And so having that difficult conversation about which kids are we helping, and having nonprofit groups, some of whom are advocates for higher performing kids who are almost to college but not quite there, versus the kids who absolutely aren't going, and having all of those really tough conversations is hard. So we're learning how to facilitate those and create the space, basically, and to keep the focus on the goal and the outcome for kids so that we can really figure out where we want to go. I'm not sure we've figured it out completely, but we have definitely moved from, boom, boom, boom in our meetings to saying we need space to let these issues arise and make sure that we actually address them transparently, make a clear decision, and move on. I don't know if that helps or not.
One of our big lessons, my big lesson in Cincinnati, was that very early in the partnership, we would start to look at data, and we would see that there was a practice that just wasn't working, right? That wasn't working. And I, as the executive director of the partnership, would try to go have a conversation with the executive director of a nonprofit by myself to talk with them about how, when we looked at the data, it doesn't seem like what you're doing is having a huge impact. That did not go so well, right? Honestly, there's still a person in Cincinnati that just does not like me, right? Because that conversation, and I did that a lot. And it was and I started to get gray hair, and my wife started to say, who are you? And I don't know you, and all that. What we learned, and actually it was the guy that I handed the work off to in Cincinnati, he realized that he had to build ownership among the partners for the work. So they stopped looking at him as being the person to have all the tough conversations. So when they started to see things that were tough, rather than him go, the superintendent would go with the head of the community foundation. And the conversation wasn't you're bad. The conversation was, we're looking at the data, and it seems like there's practices that are working, and there's certainly a portion of what you're doing that is, but is there any way for you to think about shifting what you're doing, right? Just thinking about trying something new. So over the next 3 months, we can see if a different methodology would work, right? And those conversations were much more powerful. They could come out, and don't get me wrong, there were still some hurt feelings, right? But over time, I think you've started to see that people are more open to that because the partnership staff isn't taking it on, right? The partners are taking it on. And that I think is a really key insight, to make sure that you're creating a space where those kind of discussions can be had, and then trust builds up over time, believe it or not, as you have more and more of those difficult conversations, right? We've actually said to some communities that are going through real trials that I know it stinks right now, but if you get through this, your partnership's going to be stronger than ever. Right? Because you're working through a really transparent, tough conversation. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi. I have a question about sort of the next underlying step here that I'm curious about. And it has to do with, as you adjust policies and systems effectively, and as you have these conversations subsequently that you just referred to, what's ringing in my mind is the question about paradigms. I'm not quite sure I'm trying to grasp it, but it has to do with if you shift policies and procedures and systems, and you're very effective in this regard, what about the underlying paradigms that create the disparities in the first place, for example? And is there a way to address that in the context of this work, or is that a completely separate thing? It seems to me it's critical, but I'm not sure where it resides.
So, I don't know if we would say it's central, right? And that when you look at that data flow chart, often those things are at the bottom. Contextual indicators, right? Poverty, structural racism, whatever you want to call it. And I guess what we're seeing is that when a partnership really begins to gel, right? And we would call this systems change. We have a flow chart of developmental milestones in building a partnership, and early stages exploring. Next stage is emerging, after that sustaining, and then there's systems change. And there's ways that communities exemplify that. And when you get to systems change, you as a community are starting to tackle the underlying structural issues that really could be preventing progress. Like one could be that we assume that we have to fund education equally, not equitably, right? So meaning every single child gets the exact same amount of funding. When we know that kids, I mean, if you look at any data, any data from anywhere, the data would say is that kids that come from high poverty environments need a little bit more money, right? They need more service, they need more support, they need more delivery. So an underlying structural question that you may advocate for over time is, can we be honest? Can we be honest that we need to fund things in a more balanced way, right? Where we recognize that certain kids, that would be an advocacy agenda that a partnership could take on, but not take it on because you're just passionate about it. Take it on because you're passionate about it and you have data to support it, right? You have data to support it. And then that can become your advocacy agenda. So we actually, in this developmental chart, the advocacy agenda as we see it doesn't show up right away. It shows up once you start having some of that programmatic data so that you don't get stuck in a competition with the 300 other people that are passionate about stuff but have no data.
Yeah.
Right? You want to be the people that are passionate about something and go to your legislator or go to your county administrator or whatever it may be and say, we're passionate and here's data. And then you can collectively have a different kind of voice. Does that make sense? And that's a really mature state. That's not, like that's the communities that have gone through some stuff, right? They've had some of the tough conversations and they're willing to advocate collectively for something in a different way. So that would be how we would see it playing out. A lot of people want to start with that advocacy agenda, and without that data, you're really just like everybody else out there advocating for something. And that, yeah.
And the only thing I just would add, just from kind of current experience to that we've seen, there's a guy named Junius Williams who's the CEO of Urban Strategies in Oakland, and
Yeah.
just he'll blow your mind every time you talk to him. And there's something that in my learning, as I've been, relatively new in my role here, a lot of the credibility of this process, I think both in the community and with our partners, I think is the ability to sort of not blink at some troubling things and to be honest about them. And Junius is sort of just a fearless man who would speak truth to any power on earth. And he said, if we're not talking about, structural inequality, then what are we talking about? And so, but to Jeff's point, I think that unfolds as the work moves forward. I think it's important to name, because for us, this work is about the so what. You stabilize a young person, so what? You get them to complete high school, so what? What does that ultimately lead to in terms of truly improved life outcomes? And I think if you wind it backwards, it goes to that place, to structural things. I think it's important that somebody holds that, names it, and everybody in the room, I think, says, you're right.
Amen.
But the nature of the project is that it will get there as long as someone holds on to it.
My question is actually up there already. I think the top question, which is it on? Sorry. Is it on? Yes, it is on. Just what are the most productive roles for school districts, right? Like they're the monster. They're where the kids spend most of their time. And I know this is a nonprofit thing, but I'm from the county office, and so I'm curious, kind of, what is the most productive role of school districts?
This is not a nonprofit thing. This is an everybody thing.
Yeah.
We have the County Office of Education, both on our leadership council and our executive committee, and partnering sort of at the other levels. For us, we have a very sort of focused niche on dropout recovery and moving those young folks on to post-secondary and career employment. And we'd be dead in the water if the County Office of Ed wasn't on board, both at a tactical level and a strategic level. They run the dropout recovery centers, or they will be launching them in partnership with somebody else in the room here. And also they have influence to open doors when we need them. And ultimately, when it comes to unsiloing systems, they are a system and must be willing to unsilo.
I would echo that. I would say our school we wouldn't have we wouldn't have an effort without the school districts being on board. And it's really exciting because we have 19 school districts in Marin County, and there's 4 high school districts, and they've all come together, and we've put the data together. And when you look across districts, we have some high-performing high schools and low-performing high schools, but if you disaggregate the data and you look at how are our Hispanic Latino kids performing across the county, it's fascinating, because even though there's fewer of those kids in one school district, they're not performing any better, which is unfortunate because there's not a bright spot that we can then focus in on. But the good news is it brings everybody together around the common problem to try to look a little bit deeper for those bright spots. But if they weren't in the room sharing that data, being transparent about it, and caring about the problem, this wouldn't be happening.
And the last thing I'd say on that is that the districts have every reason to be shy of being a part of something like this, because they've been, used and abused. As one person, a funder and an investor in Dallas said, I've realized that I always start by saying to the school district I want to do something with them, and about 2 weeks in I start doing things to them, right? And so they have every reason to be shy. And so back to that thing of understanding the enlightened self-interest of a district, like what would be their enlightened self-interest? And their enlightened self-interest is that people are going to share accountability for their results, so they don't get smashed. And very tactically, most of the time, they have very few data people, and they're all focused on running federal and state reports. They don't have any time to work with partners. So exactly what Ann described of putting the Ed Pioneer inside of a district for a while, we're seeing tons of partnerships do that, where they actually loan their data person, put them inside the district, help to build the infrastructure, so that whenever a nonprofit wants to know how what they're doing is impacting an outcome, you can easily get that data. That is an incredibly powerful way to bring a district along and to then share accountability. Because then the district can say, yeah, but I'm looking at all the tutoring programs. And I see a question up here, what about a tutoring, what about the fact of a kid maybe had a bad day, right? And so the data may not be good because the kid had a bad day. And I would say that's totally great. One thing we did not talk about as part of the ecosystem is a data team, a data committee. Bring together the data gurus of a community onto a team so that as you get more programmatic data, they can help make sense of it, right? Not just one individual. And that helps to make, you can identify the anomalies in the system, and that can be really powerful. So that was just a little one that I wanted to note.
I just want to jump in again. The other thing that our school districts have found enormously helpful is that if you're in a school district and you see, racial disparities or something, you're trying to do something about it. Oftentimes, there's going to be pushback from the status quo, right? So you want to change, and it's working for 80% of the kids. So why would those people want to change? But if you have an ecosystem that's countywide that has said, we want to make these changes to do this, then all of a sudden at your school board meeting, you have others there who care about the outcome rather than just the people who are scared about the change. And so that whole political dynamic really shifts when you have more people involved on a community basis at moving these outcomes.
One last question. So,
who here is from Cincinnati? Oh, is it Sky? Did you put up the
Skyline.
Skyline Chili? No, it's really good. Whoever that is, yes. The secret in Cincinnati is Skyline Chili. Thank you. Okay, very good. Yeah.
I have a question, and by the way, the lessons learned are really, really helpful, and the evolution of the concept of collective impact is really, really great. And this is a question that I've been thinking about a lot. So oftentimes what we count and measure doesn't count enough. There's some missing pieces that may be more important, and there's a lot of evidence now that culture of schools is really critical. Going from how do you shift a culture of sort of individual fear and compliance to collective learning and excitement about learning. And that doesn't show up easily in a lot of data. So what I'm wondering is how you deal in those situations around culture shifts and around what we're hearing that character qualities and social emotional stuff may be much more important than any of those other factors that you're looking at. And where is that headed in the collective impact movement at this point in time?
Great question. So is Deming a Stanford guy? Edward Deming? Do we know? No, is he a Harvard guy? He's a Harvard guy? I'm sorry. I shouldn't even have brought him up. But You know, he said culture eats strategy for lunch every day of the week, right? And so, you know, there is no two ways about it that probably the biggest barrier to collective impact happening is the culture of fear around data. So there's very concrete tactics we're seeing. I mentioned one last night where we see Austin. In Austin, every meeting starts related to the partnership with a data moment, where they throw up some data and everybody makes sense of it for themselves. So people start to get comfortable with data. There's a community, Menominee Falls, Wisconsin, which is my favorite place on the earth right now, even more than Skyline in Cincinnati. And in Menominee Falls, the superintendent there, 5 years ago, got her 20% of top teachers to embrace continuous improvement. And they started using data in their classrooms. And they got it down to the child level where the child actually leads parent-teacher conferences, talking about their data and talking about the small tests of change that they are doing, right, around their data. And now the entire school, every single classroom in that school is using data in creative ways because she created a demand, a hunger for it by starting with that nucleus of folks. So I would just say that figuring out creative ways like that to make it cool to use data and make it cool to get bigger impact, investors play a huge role in that. If an investor will say, I will actually celebrate your failure, right? I will celebrate your failure as long as you learn from it, right? And apply those learnings in very tangible ways. If an investor says that, it can create an environment where people start to be much more comfortable around that. And then on social emotional learning, we're seeing tons of communities that are trying to figure out how to measure it in a cost-effective way. Like grit, like in New York, there's a group of 20 program providers that are testing out this survey related to grit that can be attached to standardized assessments. So it's not a huge new test on top of everything else, right? There's folks all over the country that are trying to figure that out. And I would say in the next 3 years, we'll have that figured out, but we need to figure out how to do it at a population level. And that's what communities are testing, which is really exciting, I think. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I hate to close it up like that because I know there are a lot of other great questions out there, but unfortunately our time is coming to an end. So I hope you'll join me in thanking Jeff, Anne, and Joe for sharing both all their energy, but also their best practices and playbook, I think, on collective impact. I think it's just been such a pleasure for all of us today. So thank you so much.